Chapter 5 of Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. This legamus recording may be distributed and adapted freely for any purpose. Read by a fine voice. On the eastern side of Huesca, until late March, nothing happened. Almost literally nothing. We were 1,200 metres from the enemy. When the fascists were driven back into Huesca, the Republican army troops who held this part of the line had not been overzealous in their advance, so that the line formed a kind of pocket. Later it would have to be advanced, a ticklish job under fire, but for the present the enemy might as well have been non-existent. Our sole preoccupation was keeping warm and getting enough to eat. As a matter of fact, there were things in this period that interested me greatly, and I will describe some of them later. But I shall be keeping nearer to the order of events if I try here to give some account of the internal political situation on the government side. At the beginning, I had ignored the political side of the war, and it was only about this time that it began to force itself upon my attention. If you are not interested in the horrors of party politics, please skip. I am trying to keep the political parts of this narrative in separate chapters for precisely that purpose. But at the same time, it would be quite impossible to write about the Spanish War from a purely military angle. It was above all things a political war. No event in it, at any rate during the first year, is intelligible unless one has some grasp of the inter-party struggle that was going on behind the government lines. When I came to Spain, and for some time afterwards, I was not only uninterested in the political situation, but unaware of it. I knew there was a war on, but I had no notion what kind of a war. If you had asked me why I had joined the militia, I should have answered, to fight against fascism. And if you had asked me what I was fighting for, I should have answered, common decency. I had accepted the News Chronicle, New Statesman version of the war as the defence of civilization against a maniacal outbreak by an army of Colonel Blimps in the pay of Hitler. The revolutionary atmosphere of Barcelona had attracted me deeply, but I had made no attempt to understand it. As for the kaleidoscope of political parties and trade unions with their tiresome names, PSUC, POUM, FAI, CNT, UGT, JCI, JSU, AIT, they merely exasperated me. It looked at first sight as though Spain was suffering from a plague of initials. I knew that I was serving in something called the POUM. I had only joined the POUM militia rather than any other because I happened to arrive in Barcelona with ILP papers. But I did not realise that there were serious differences between the political parties. At Monte Pothero, when they pointed to the position on our left and said, "Those are the socialists," meaning the PSUC, I was puzzled and said, "Aren't we all socialists?" I thought it idiotic that people fighting for their lives should have separate parties. My attitude always was, why can't we drop all this political nonsense and get on with the war? This, of course, was the correct anti-fascist attitude, which had been carefully disseminated by the English newspapers, largely in order to prevent people from grasping the real nature of the struggle. But in Spain, especially in Catalonia, it was an attitude that no one could or did keep up indefinitely. Everyone, however unwillingly, took sides sooner or later. For even if one cared nothing for the political parties and their conflicting lines, it was too obvious that one's own destiny was involved. As a militiaman, one was a soldier against Franco, but one was also a pawn in an enormous struggle that was being fought out between two political theories. When I scrounged for firewood on the mountainside and wondered whether this was really a war or whether the News Chronicle had made it up, when I dodged the communist machine guns in the Barcelona riots, when I finally fled from Spain with the police one jump behind me, all these things happened to me in that particular way because I was serving in the POUM militia and not in the PSUC. So great is the difference between two sets of initials. To understand the alignment on the government side, one has got to remember how the war started. When the fighting broke out on 18th of July, it is probable that every anti-fascist in Europe felt a thrill of hope. For here at last, apparently, was democracy standing up to fascism. For years past, the so-called democratic countries had been surrendering to fascism at every step. The Japanese had been allowed to do as they liked in Manchuria. Hitler had walked into power and proceeded to massacre political opponents of all shades. Mussolini had bombed the Abyssinians, while 53 nations, I think it was 53, made pious noises off. But when Franco tried to overthrow a mildly left-wing government, the Spanish people, against all expectation, had risen against him. It seemed, possibly it was, the turning of the tide. But there were several points that escaped general notice. To begin with, Franco was not strictly comparable with Hitler or Mussolini. His rising was a military mutiny backed up by the aristocracy and the church, and in the main, especially at the beginning, it was an attempt not so much to impose fascism as to restore feudalism. This meant that Franco had against him not only the working class, but also various sections of the liberal bourgeoisie, the very people who are the supporters of fascism when it appears in a more modern form. More important than this was the fact that the Spanish working class did not, as we might conceivably do in England, resist Franco in the name of democracy and the status quo. Their resistance was accompanied by, one might almost say it consisted of, a definite revolutionary outbreak. Land was seized by the peasants. Many factories and most of the transport were seized by the trade unions. Churches were wrecked and the priests driven out or killed. The Daily Mail, amid the cheers of the Catholic clergy, was able to represent Franco as a patriot, delivering his country from hordes of fiendish Reds. For the first few months of the war, Franco's real opponent was not so much the government as the trade unions. As soon as the rising broke out, the organised town workers replied by calling a general strike, and then by demanding, and after a struggle, getting, arms from the public arsenals. If they had not acted spontaneously and more or less independently, it is quite conceivable that Franco would never have been resisted. There can, of course, be no certainty about this, but there is at least reason for thinking it. The government had made little or no attempt to forestall the rising, which had been foreseen for a long time past, and when the trouble started its attitude was weak and hesitant, so much so, indeed, that Spain had 3 premiers in a single day. Quiroga, Barrios and Giral. The first 2 refused to distribute arms to the trade unions. Moreover, the one step that could save the immediate situation, the arming of the workers, was only taken unwillingly and in response to violent popular clamour. However, the arms were distributed, and in the big towns of eastern Spain, the fascists were defeated by a huge effort, mainly of the working class, aided by some of the armed forces, assault guards, etc., who had remained loyal. It was the kind of effort that could probably only be made by people who were fighting with a revolutionary intention, i.e. believed that they were fighting for something better than the status quo. In the various centres of revolt it is thought that 3,000 people died in the streets in a single day. Men and women, armed only with sticks of dynamite, rushed across the open squares and stormed stone buildings held by trained soldiers with machine guns. Machine gun nests that the fascists had placed at strategic spots were smashed by rushing taxis at them at 60 miles an hour. Even if one had heard nothing of the seizure of the land by the peasants, the setting up of local Soviets, etc., it would be hard to believe that the anarchists and socialists, who were the backbone of the resistance, were doing this kind of thing for the preservation of capitalist democracy, which, especially in the anarchist view, was no more than a centralised swindling machine. Meanwhile, the workers had weapons in their hands, and at this stage they refrained from giving them up. Even a year later it was computed that the anarcho-syndicalists in Catalonia possessed 30,000 rifles. The estates of the big pro-fascist landlords were in many places seized by the peasants. Along with the collectivization of industry and transport, there was an attempt to set up the rough beginnings of a workers' government by means of local committees workers' patrols to replace the old pro-capitalist police forces, workers' militias based on the trade unions, and so forth. Of course, the process was not uniform, and it went further in Catalonia than elsewhere. There were areas where the institutions of local government remained almost untouched, and others where they existed side by side with revolutionary committees. In a few places, independent anarchist communes were set up, and some of them remained in being till about a year later, when they were forcibly suppressed by the government. In Catalonia, for the first few months, most of the actual power was in the hands of the anarcho-syndicalists, who controlled most of the key industries. The thing that had happened in Spain was, in fact, not merely a civil war, but the beginning of a revolution. It is this fact that the anti-fascist press outside Spain has made it its special business to obscure. The issue has been narrowed down to fascism versus democracy, and the revolutionary aspect concealed as much as possible. In England, where the press is more centralised and the public more easily deceived than elsewhere, only two versions of the Spanish War have had any publicity to speak of: the right-wing version of Christian patriots versus Bolsheviks dripping with blood, and the left-wing version of gentlemanly Republicans quelling a military revolt. The central issue has been successfully covered up. There were several reasons for this. To begin with, appalling lies about atrocities were being circulated by the pro-fascist press, and well-meaning propagandists undoubtedly thought that they were aiding the Spanish government by denying that Spain had gone red. But the main reason was this, that, except for the small revolutionary groups which exist in all countries, the whole world was determined upon preventing revolution in Spain. In particular, the Communist Party, with Soviet Russia behind it, had thrown its whole weight against the revolution. It was the communist thesis that revolution at this stage would be fatal, and that what was to be aimed at in Spain was not workers' control, but bourgeois democracy. It hardly needs pointing out why liberal capitalist opinion took the same line. Foreign capital was heavily invested in Spain. The Barcelona Traction Company, for instance, represented 10 millions of British capital, and meanwhile the trade unions had seized all the transport in Catalonia. If the revolution went forward, there would be no compensation, or very little. If the capitalist republic prevailed, foreign investments would be safe. And since the revolution had got to be crushed, it greatly simplified things to pretend that no revolution had happened. In this way, the real significance of every event could be covered up. Every shift of power from the trade unions to the central government could be represented as a necessary step in military reorganisation. The situation produced was curious in the extreme. Outside Spain, few people grasped that there was a revolution. Inside Spain, nobody doubted it. Even the PSUC newspapers. Communists controlled and more or less committed to an anti-revolutionary policy talked about our glorious revolution, and meanwhile the communist press in foreign countries was shouting that there was no sign of revolution anywhere. The seizure of factories, setting up of workers' committees, etc., had not happened, or alternatively, had happened but had no political significance. According to the Daily Worker, 6th of August 1936, those who said that the Spanish people were fighting for social revolution or for anything other than bourgeois democracy were downright lying scoundrels. On the other hand, Juan López, a member of the Valencia government, declared in February 1937 that the Spanish people are shedding their blood not for the democratic republic and its paper constitution, but for a revolution. So it would appear that the downright lying scoundrels included members of the government, for which we were bidden to fight. Some of the foreign anti-fascist papers even descended to the pitiful lie of pretending that churches were only attacked when they were used as fascist fortresses. Actually, churches were pillaged everywhere, and as a matter of course, because it was perfectly well understood that the Spanish church was part of the capitalist racket. In 6 months in Spain, I only saw 2 undamaged churches, and until about July 1937, no churches were allowed to reopen and hold services except for one or two Protestant churches in Madrid. But after all, it was only the beginning of a revolution, not the complete thing. Even when the workers, certainly in Catalonia and possibly elsewhere, had the power to do so, they did not overthrow or completely replace the government. Obviously they could not do so when Franco was hammering at the gate and sections of the middle class were on their side. The country was in a transitional state that was capable either of developing in the direction of socialism or of reverting to an ordinary capitalist republic. The peasants had most of the land, and they were likely to keep it, unless Franco won. All large industries had been collectivized, but whether they remained collectivized or whether capitalism was reintroduced would depend finally upon which group gained control. At the beginning, both the central government and the Generalitat de Catalunya, the semi-autonomous Catalan government, could definitely be said to represent the working class. The government was headed by Caballero, a left-wing socialist, and contained ministers representing the UGT, socialist trade unions, and the CNT, syndicalist unions controlled by the anarchists. The Catalan Generalitat was for a while virtually superseded by an anti-fascist defence committee, Comité Central de Milicias Antifascistas. Delegates were chosen in proportion to the membership of their organisations. 9 delegates represented the trade unions, 3 the Catalan liberal parties, and 2 the various Marxist parties, POUM, communists and others, consisting mainly of delegates from the trade unions. Later, the Defence Committee was dissolved, and the Generalitat was reconstituted so as to represent the unions and the various left-wing parties, but every subsequent reshuffling of the government was a move towards the right. First, the POUM was expelled from the Generalitat. 6 months later, Caballero was replaced by the right-wing socialist Neran. Shortly afterwards, the CNT was eliminated from the government, then the UGT. Then the CNT was turned out of the Generalitat. Finally, a year after the outbreak of war and revolution, there remained a government composed entirely of right-wing socialists, liberals and communists. The general swing to the right dates from about October to November 1936, when the USSR began to supply arms to the government and power began to pass from the anarchists to the communists. Except Russia and Mexico, no country had had the decency to come to the rescue of the government, and Mexico, for obvious reasons, could not supply arms in large quantities. Consequently, the Russians were in a position to dictate terms. There is very little doubt that these terms were, in substance, prevent revolution or you get no weapons, and that the first move against the revolutionary elements, the expulsion of the POUM from the Catalan Generalitat, was done under orders from the USSR. It has been denied that any direct pressure was exerted by the Russian government, but the point is not of great importance, for the communist parties of all countries can be taken as carrying out Russian policy, and it is not denied that the Communist Party was the chief mover, first against the POUM, later against the anarchists, and against Caballero's section of the socialists, and in general against a revolutionary policy. Once the USSR had intervened, the triumph of the Communist Party was assured. To begin with, gratitude to Russia for the arms, and the fact that the Communist Party, especially since the arrival of the international brigades, looked capable of winning the war, immensely raised the communist prestige. Secondly, the Russian arms were supplied via the Communist Party and the parties allied to them, who saw to it that as few as possible got to their political opponents. This was why there were so few Russian arms on the Aragon front, where the troops were predominantly anarchist. Until April 1937, the only Russian weapon I saw, with the exception of some aeroplanes which may or may not have been Russian, was a solitary submachine gun. Thirdly, by proclaiming a non-revolutionary policy, the communists were able to gather in all those whom the extremists had scared. It was easy, for instance, to rally the wealthier peasants against the collectivization policy of the anarchists. there was an enormous growth in the membership of the party, and the influx was largely from the middle class, shopkeepers, officials, army officers, well-to-do peasants, etc., etc. The war was essentially a triangular struggle. The fight against Franco had to continue, but the simultaneous aim of the government was to recover such power as remained in the hands of the trade unions. It was done by a series of small moves, a policy of pinpricks, as somebody called it, and on the whole very cleverly. There was no general and obvious counter-revolutionary move, and until May 1937 it was scarcely necessary to use force. The workers could always be brought to heel by an argument that is almost too obvious to need stating. Unless you do this, that and the other, we shall lose the war. In every case, needless to say, it appeared that the thing demanded by military necessity was the surrender of something that the workers had won for themselves in 1936. But the argument could hardly fail, because to lose the war was the last thing that the revolutionary parties wanted. If the war was lost, democracy and revolution, socialism and anarchism became meaningless words. The anarchists, the only revolutionary party that was big enough to matter, were obliged to give way on point after point. The process of collectivization was checked, the local committees were got rid of, the workers' patrols were abolished, and the pre-war police forces, largely reinforced and very heavily armed, were restored, and various key industries which had been under the control of the trade unions were taken over by the government. The seizure of the Barcelona telephone exchange, which led to the May fighting, was one incident in this process. Finally, most important of all, the workers' militias, based on the trade unions, were gradually broken up and redistributed among the new popular army, a non-political army on semi-bourgeois lines, with a different pay rate, a privileged officer caste, etc., etc. In the special circumstances, this was the really decisive step. It happened later in Catalonia than elsewhere, because it was there that the revolutionary parties were strongest. Obviously, the only guarantee that the workers could have of retaining their winnings was to keep some of the armed forces under their own control. As usual, the breaking up of the militias was done in the name of military efficiency, and no one denied that the thorough military reorganisation was needed. It would, however, have been quite possible to reorganise the militias and make them more efficient while keeping them under direct control of the trade unions. The main purpose of the change was to make sure that the anarchists did not possess an army of their own. Moreover, the democratic spirit of the militias made them breeding grounds for revolutionary ideas. The communists were well aware of this and inveighed ceaselessly and bitterly against the POUM and anarchist principle of equal pay for all ranks. A general bourgeoisification, a deliberate destruction of the equalitarian spirit of the first few months of the revolution was taking place. All happened so swiftly that people making successive visits to Spain, at intervals of a few months, have declared that they seemed scarcely to be visiting the same country. What had seemed on the surface, and for a brief instant to be a workers' state, was changing before one's eyes into an ordinary bourgeois republic, with the normal division into rich and poor. By the autumn of 1937, the socialist Negrin was declaring in public speeches that we respect private property, and members of the Cortes, who at the beginning of the war had had to fly the country because of their suspected fascist sympathies, were returning to Spain. The whole process is easy to understand if one remembers that it proceeds from the temporary alliance that fascism in certain forms forces upon the bourgeois and the worker. This alliance, known as the Popular Front, is in essential an alliance of enemies, and it seems probable that it must always end by one partner swallowing the other. The only unexpected feature in the Spanish situation, and outside Spain it has caused an immense amount of misunderstanding, is that among the parties on the government side, the communists stood not upon the extreme left, but upon the extreme right. In reality, this should cause no surprise, because the tactics of the Communist Party elsewhere, especially in France, have made it clear that official communism must be regarded, at any rate for the time being, as an anti-revolutionary force. The whole of Comintern policy is now subordinated, excusably considering the world situation, to the defence of USSR, which depends upon a system of military alliances. In particular, the USSR is an alliance with France, a capitalist imperialist country. The alliance is of little use to Russia unless French capitalism is strong. Therefore, communist policy in France has got to be anti-revolutionary. This means not only that French communists now march behind the tricolour and sing the Marseillaise, but what is more important, that they have had to drop all effective agitation in the French colonies. It is less than 3 years since Thorez, the secretary of the French Communist Party, was declaring that the French workers would never be bamboozled into fighting against their German comrades. In the Chamber of Deputies, March 1935. He is now one of the loudest lunged patriots in France. The clue to the behaviour of the Communist Party in any country is the military relation of that country, actual or potential, towards the USSR. In England, for instance, the position is still uncertain. Hence the English Communist Party is still hostile to the national government and, ostensibly, opposed to rearmament. If, however, Great Britain enters into an alliance or military understanding with the USSR, the English communist, like the French communist, will have no choice but to become a good patriot and imperialist. There are premonitory signs of this already. In Spain, the communist line was undoubtedly influenced by the fact that France, Russia's ally, would strongly object to a revolutionary neighbour and would raise heaven and earth to prevent the liberation of Spanish Morocco. The Daily Mail, with its tales of Red Revolution financed by Moscow, was even more wildly wrong than usual. In reality, it was the communists, above all others, who prevented revolution in Spain. Later, when the right-wing forces were in full control, the communists showed themselves willing to go a great deal further than the liberals in hunting down the revolutionary leaders. For the best account of the interplay between the parties on the government side, see Franz Birkenau's The Spanish Cockpit. This is by a long way the ablest book that has yet appeared on the Spanish War. I have tried to sketch the general course of the Spanish Revolution during its first year, because this makes it easier to understand the situation at any given moment. But I do not want to suggest that in February I held all of the opinions that are implied in what I have said above. To begin with, the things that most enlightened me had not yet happened, and in any case my sympathies were in some ways different from what they are now. This was partly because the political side of the war bored me, and I naturally reacted against the viewpoint of which I heard most, i.e. the POUM-ILP viewpoint. The Englishmen I was among were mostly ILP members, with a few CP members among them, and most of them were much better educated politically than myself. For weeks on end during the dull period when nothing was happening round Huesca, I found myself in the middle of a political discussion that practically never ended. In the draughty, evil-smelling barn of the farmhouse where we were billeted, in the stuffy blackness of dugouts, behind the parapet in the freezing midnight hours, the conflicting party lines were debated over and over. Among the Spaniards it was the same, and most of the newspapers we saw made the inter-party feud their chief feature. One would have had to be deaf or an imbecile not to pick up some idea of what the various parties stood for. From the point of view of political theory, there were only 3 parties that mattered: the PSUC, the POUM, and the CNT-FAI, loosely described as the anarchists. I take the PSU first as being the most important. It was the party that finally triumphed, and even at this time it was visibly in the ascendant. It is necessary to explain that when one speaks of the PSUC line, one really means the Communist Party line. The PSUC, Partido Socialista Unificado de Catalunya, was the Socialist Party of Catalonia. It had been formed at the beginning of the war by the fusion of various Marxist parties, including the Catalan Communist Party, but it was now entirely under communist control and was affiliated to the Third International. Elsewhere in Spain, no formal unification between socialists and communists had taken place, but the communist viewpoint and the right-wing socialist viewpoint could everywhere be regarded as identical. Roughly speaking, the PSUC was the political organ of the UGT, Unión General de Trabajadores, the socialist trade unions. The membership of these unions throughout Spain now numbered about 1.5 million. They contained many sections of the manual workers, but since the outbreak of war they had also been swollen by a large influx of middle-class members, for in the early revolutionary days people of all kinds had found it useful to join either the UGT or the CNT. The two blocks of unions overlapped, but of the two, the CNT was more definitely a working-class organisation. The PSUC was therefore a party partly of the workers and partly of the small bourgeoisie, the shopkeepers, the officials, and the wealthier peasants. The PSUC line, which was preached in the communist and pro-communist press throughout the world, was approximately this: at present, nothing matters except winning the war. Without victory in the war, all else is meaningless. Therefore, this is not the moment to talk of pressing forward with the revolution. We can't afford to alienate the peasants by forcing collectivization upon them, and we can't afford to frighten away the middle classes who were fighting on our side. Above all, for the sake of efficiency, we must do away with revolutionary chaos. We must have a strong central government in place of local committees, and we must have a properly trained and fully militarized army under a unified command. Clinging on to fragments of workers' control and parroting revolutionary phrases is worse than useless. It is not merely obstructive, but even counter-revolutionary, because it leads to divisions which can be used against us by the fascists. At this stage we are not fighting for the dictatorship of the proletariat, we are fighting for parliamentary democracy. Whoever tries to turn the civil war into a social revolution is playing into the hands of the fascists, and is in effect, if not in intention, a traitor. The POUM line differed from this on every point, except, of course, the importance of winning the war. The POUM, Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, was one of those dissident communist parties which have appeared in many countries in the last few years as a result of the opposition to Stalinism, i.e. to the change, real or apparent, in communist policy. It was made up partly of ex-communists and partly of an earlier party, the Workers' and Peasants' Bloc. The figures for the POUM membership are given as July 1936, 10,000, December 1936, 70,000, June 1937, 40,000, but these are from POUM sources. A hostile estimate would probably divide them by 4. The only thing one can say with any certainty about the membership of the Spanish political parties is that every party overestimates its own numbers. Numerically, it was a small party, with not much influence outside Catalonia, and chiefly important because it contained an unusually high proportion of politically conscious members. In Catalonia, its chief stronghold was Lerida. It did not represent any bloc of trade unions. The POUM militiamen were mostly CNT members, but the actual party members generally belonged to the UGT. It was, however, only in the CNT that the POUM had any influence. The POUM line was approximately this: it is nonsense to talk of opposing fascism by bourgeois democracy. Bourgeois democracy is only another name for capitalism, and so is fascism. To fight against fascism on behalf of democracy is to fight against one form of capitalism on behalf of a second, which is liable to turn into the first at any moment. The only real alternative to fascism is workers' control. If you set up any less goal than this, you will either hand the victory to Franco or at best let in fascism by the back door. Meanwhile, the workers must cling to every scrap of what they have won. If they yield anything to the semi-bourgeois government, they can depend upon being cheated. The workers' militias and police forces must be preserved in their present form, and every effort to bourgeoisify them must be resisted. If the workers do not control the armed forces, the armed forces will control the workers, the war and the revolution are inseparable. The anarchist viewpoint is less easily defined. In any case, the loose term anarchists is used to cover a multitude of people of very varying opinions. The huge block of unions making up the CNT, Confederación Nacional de Trabajadores, with round about 2 million members in all, had for its political organ the FAI, Federación Anarquista Ibérica, an actual anarchist organisation, but even the members of the FAI, though always tinged, as perhaps most Spaniards are, with the anarchist philosophy, were not necessarily anarchists in the purest sense. Especially since the beginning of the war, they had moved more in the direction of ordinary socialism, because circumstances had forced them to take part in centralised administration and even to break all their principles by entering the government. Nevertheless, they differed fundamentally from the communists in so much that, like the POUM, they aimed at workers' control and not a parliamentary democracy. They accepted the POUM slogan, "The war and the revolution are inseparable," though they were less dogmatic about it. Roughly speaking, the CNT FAI stood for 1. Direct control over industry by the workers engaged in each industry, e.g. transport, the textile factories, etc. 2. Government by local committees and resistance to all forms of centralised authoritarianism. 3. Uncompromising hostility to the bourgeoisie and the church. The last point, though the least precise, was the most important. The anarchists were the opposite of the majority of so-called revolutionaries, insomuch that though their principles were rather vague, their hatred of privilege and injustice was perfectly genuine. Philosophically, communism and anarchism are poles apart. Practically, i.e. in the form of society aimed at, the difference is mainly one of emphasis, but it is quite irreconcilable. The communists' emphasis is always on centralism and efficiency, the anarchists on liberty and equality. Anarchism is deeply rooted in Spain and is likely to outlive communism when the Russian influence is withdrawn. During the first 2 months of the war, it was the anarchists more than anyone else who had saved the situation, and much later than this, the anarchist militia, in spite of their indiscipline, were notoriously the best fighters among the purely Spanish forces. From about February 1937 onwards, the anarchists and the POUM could to some extent be lumped together. If the anarchists, the POUM and the left wing of the socialists had had the sense to combine at the start and press a realistic policy, the history of the war might have been different. But in the early period, when the revolutionary parties seemed to have the game in their hands, this was impossible. Between the anarchists and the socialists there were ancient jealousies. The POUM, as Marxists, was sceptical of anarchism, while from the pure anarchist standpoint, the Trotskyism of the POUM was not much preferable to the Stalinism of the communists. Nevertheless, the communist tactics tended to drive the two parties together. When the POUM joined in the disastrous fighting in Barcelona in May, it was mainly from an instinct to stand by the CNT, and later, when the POUM was suppressed, the anarchists were the only people who dared to raise a voice in its defence. So, roughly speaking, the alignment of forces was this. On the one side, the CNT, FAI, the POUM and a section of the socialists standing for workers' control. On the other side, the right-wing socialists, liberals and communists standing for centralised government and a militarised army. It is easy to see why at this time I preferred the communist viewpoint to that of the POUM. The communists had a definite practical policy, an obviously better policy from the point of view of the common sense, which looks only a few months ahead. And certainly the day-to-day policy of the POUM, their propaganda and so forth, was unspeakably bad. It must have been so, or they would have been able to attract a bigger mass following. What clinched everything was that the communists, so it seemed to me, were getting on with the war, while we and the anarchists were standing still. This was the general feeling at the time. The communists had gained power and a vast increase of membership, partly by appealing to the middle classes against the revolutionaries, but partly also because they were the only people who looked capable of winning the war. The Russian arms and the magnificent defence of Madrid by troops mainly under communist control had made the communists the heroes of Spain. As someone put it, every Russian aeroplane that flew over our heads was communist propaganda. The revolutionary purism of the POUM, though I saw its logic, seemed to me rather futile. After all, the one thing that mattered was to win the war. Meanwhile, there was the diabolical inter-party feud that was going on in the newspapers, in pamphlets, on posters, in books, everywhere. At this time, the newspapers I saw most often were the POUM papers, La Battaglia and Adelante, and their ceaseless carping against the counter-revolutionary PSUC struck me as priggish and tiresome. Later, when I studied the PSUC and communist press more closely, I realised that the POUM were almost blameless compared with their adversaries. Apart from anything else, they had much smaller opportunities. Unlike the communists, they had no footing in any press outside their own country, and inside Spain they were at an immense disadvantage because the press censorship was mainly under communist control, which meant that the POUM papers were liable to be suppressed or fined if they said anything damaging. It is also fair to the POUM to say that though they might preach endless sermons on revolution and quote Lenin ad nauseum, they did not usually indulge in personal libel. Also, they kept their polemics mainly to newspaper articles. Their large coloured posters designed for a wider public — posters are important in Spain with its large illiterate population — did not attack rival parties, but were simply anti-fascist or abstractedly revolutionary. So were the songs the militiamen sang. The communist attacks were quite a different matter. I shall have to deal with some of these later in this book. Here I can only give a brief indication of the communist line of attack. On the surface, the quarrel between the communists and the POUM was one of tactics. The POUM was for immediate revolution, the communists not. So far so good. There was much to be said on both sides. Further, the communists contended that the POUM propaganda divided and weakened the government forces and thus endangered the war. Again, though finally I do not agree, a good case could be made out for this, but here the peculiarity of communist tactics came in. Tentatively at first, then more loudly, they began to assert that the POUM was splitting the government forces not by bad judgment, but by deliberate design. The POUM was declared to be no more than a gang of disguised fascists in the pay of Franco and Hitler, who were pressing a pseudo-revolutionary policy as a way of aiding the fascist cause. The POUM was a Trotskyist organisation and Franco's fifth column. This implied that scores of thousands of working-class people, including 8,000 or 10,000 soldiers who were freezing in the front-line trenches, and hundreds of foreigners who had come to Spain to fight against fascism, often sacrificing their livelihood and their nationality by doing so, were simply traitors in the pay of the enemy. And this story was spread all over Spain by means of posters, etc., and repeated over and over in the communist and pro-communist press of the whole world. I could fill half a dozen books with quotations if I chose to collect them. This then was what they were saying about us. We were Trotskyists, fascists, traitors, murderers, cowards, spies, and so forth. I admit it was not pleasant, especially when one thought of some of the people who were responsible for it. It is not a nice thing to see a Spanish boy of 15 carried down the line on a stretcher with a dazed white face looking out from among the blankets, and to think of the sleek persons in London and Paris who are writing pamphlets to prove that this boy is a fascist in disguise. One of the most horrible features of war is that all the war propaganda, all the screaming and lies and hatred, comes invariably from people who are not fighting. The PSUC militiamen whom I knew in the line, the communists from the International Brigade whom I met from time to time, never called me a Trotskyist or a traitor. They left that kind of thing to the journalists in the rear. The people who wrote pamphlets against us and vilified us in the newspapers all remained safe at home, or at worst in the newspaper offices of Valencia, hundreds of miles from the bullets and the mud. And apart from the libels of the inter-party feud, all the usual war stuff, the tub-thumping, the heroics, the vilification of the enemy, all these were done, as usual, by people who are not fighting, and who in many cases would have run 100 miles sooner than fight. One of the dreariest effects of this war has been to teach me that the left-wing press is every bit as spurious and dishonest as that of the right. I should like to make an exception of the Manchester Guardian. In connection with this book, I have had to go through the files of a good many English papers. Of our larger papers, the Manchester Guardian is the only one that leaves me with an increased respect for its honesty. I do earnestly feel that on our side, the government side, this war was different from ordinary imperialistic wars, but from the nature of the war propaganda, you would never have guessed it. The fighting had barely started when the newspapers of the right and left dived simultaneously into the same cesspool of abuse. We all remember the Daily Mail's poster, "Reds crucify nuns," while to the Daily Worker, Franco's Foreign Legion was composed of murderers, white slavers, dope fiends, and the offal of every European country. As late as October 1937, the New Statesman was treating us to tales of fascist barricades made of the bodies of living children, a most unhandy thing to make barricades with, and Mr. Arthur Bryant was declaring that the sawing off of a conservative tradesman's legs was a commonplace in loyalist Spain. The people who write that kind of stuff never fight. Possibly they believe that to write it is a substitute for fighting. It is the same in all wars. The soldiers do the fighting, the journalists do the shouting, and no true patriot ever gets near a front-line trench, except on the briefest of propaganda tours. Sometimes it is a comfort to me to think that the aeroplane is altering the conditions of war. Perhaps when the next great war comes, we may see that sight unprecedented in all history, a jingo with a bullet hole in him. The part of it went, this war was a racket like all other wars. But there was this difference, that whereas the journalists usually reserved their most murderous invective for the enemy, in this case, as time went on, the communists and the POUM came to write more bitterly about one another than about the fascists. Nevertheless, at the time I could not bring myself to take it very seriously. The inter-party feud was annoying and even disgusting, but it appeared to me as a domestic squabble. I did not believe that it would alter anything, or that there was any really irreconcilable difference of policy. I grasped that the communists and liberals had set their faces against allowing the revolution to go forward. I did not grasp that they might be capable of swinging it back. There was a good reason for this. All this time I was at the front, and at the front the social and political atmosphere did not change. I had left Barcelona in early January, and I did not go on leave till late April, and all this time, indeed till later, in the strip of Aragon controlled by anarchist and POUM troops, the same conditions persisted, at least outwardly. The revolutionary atmosphere remained as I had first known it. General and private, peasant and militiaman still met as equals. Everyone drew the same pay, wore the same clothes, ate the same food, and called everyone else thou and comrade. There was no boss class, no menial class, no beggars, no prostitutes, no lawyers, no priests, no bootlicking, no cap-touching. I was breathing the air of equality, and I was simple enough to imagine that it existed all over Spain. I did not realize that more or less by chance I was isolated among the most revolutionary section of the Spanish working class. So, when my more politically educated comrades told me that one could not take a purely military attitude towards the war, and that the choice lay between revolution and fascism, I was inclined to laugh at them. On the whole, I accepted the communist viewpoint, which boiled down to saying, we can't talk of revolution till we've won the war, and not the POUM viewpoint, which boiled down to saying, we must go forward or we shall go back. When later on I decided that the POUM were right, or at any rate righter than the communists, it was not altogether upon a point of theory. On paper, the communist case was a good one. The trouble was that their actual behaviour made it difficult to believe that they were advancing it in good faith. The often repeated slogan, "The war first and the revolution afterwards," though devoutly believed in by the average PSUC militiaman, who honestly thought that the revolution could continue when the war had been won, was eyewash. The thing for which the communists were working was not to postpone the Spanish Revolution till a more suitable time, but to make sure that it never happened. This became more and more obvious as time went on, as power was twisted more and more out of working class hands, and as more and more revolutionaries of every shade were flung into jail. Every move was made in the name of military necessity, because this pretext was, so to speak, ready-made. But the effect was to drive the workers back from an advantageous position and into a position in which, when the war was over, they would find it impossible to resist the reintroduction of capitalism. Please notice that I am saying nothing against the rank-and-file communists, least of all against the thousands of communists who died heroically round Madrid. But those were not the men who were directing party policy. As for the people higher up, it is inconceivable that they were not acting with their eyes open. But finally the war was worth winning, even if the revolution was lost. And in the end I came to doubt whether, in the long run, the communist policy made for victory. Very few people seem to have reflected that a different policy might be appropriate at different periods of the war. The anarchists probably saved the situation in the first 2 months, but they were incapable of organising resistance beyond a certain point. The communists probably saved the situation in October to December, but to win the war outright was a different matter. In England, the communist war policy has been accepted without question, because very few criticisms of it have been allowed to get into print, and because its general line, do away with revolutionary chaos, speed up production, militarise the army, sounds realistic and efficient. It is worth pointing out its inherent weakness. In order to check every revolutionary tendency and make the war as much like an ordinary war as possible, it became necessary to throw away the strategic opportunities that actually existed. I have described how we were armed, or not armed, on the Aragon front. There is very little doubt that arms were deliberately withheld, lest too many of them should get into the hands of the anarchists, who would afterwards use them for a revolutionary purpose. Consequently, the big Aragon offensive, which would have made Franco draw back from Bilbao, and possibly from Madrid, never happened. But this was comparatively a small matter. What was more important was that once the war had been narrowed down to a war for democracy, it became impossible to make any large-scale appeal for working-class aid abroad. If we face facts, we must admit that the working class of the world has regarded the Spanish War with detachment. Tens of thousands of individuals came to fight, but the tens of millions behind them remained apathetic. During the first year of the war, the entire British public is thought to have subscribed to various Aid Spain funds about £250,000, probably less than half of what they spend in a single week on going to the pictures. The way in which the working class in the democratic countries could really have helped her Spanish comrades was by industrial action, strikes and boycotts. No such thing ever even began to happen. The Labour and Communist leaders everywhere declared that it was unthinkable, and no doubt they were right, so long as they were also shouting at the tops of their voices that Red Spain was not red. Since 1914 to 18, War for Democracy has had a sinister sound. For years past, the communists themselves have been teaching the militant workers in all countries that democracy was a polite name for capitalism. To say first democracy is a swindle and then fight for democracy is not good tactics. If, with the huge prestige of Soviet Russia behind them, they had appealed to the workers of the world in the name not of democratic Spain, but of revolutionary Spain, it is hard to believe that they would not have got a response. But what was most important of all with a non-revolutionary policy, it was difficult, if not impossible, to strike at Franco's rear. By the summer of 1937, Franco was controlling a larger population than the government, much larger if one counts in the colonies, with about the same number of troops. As everyone knows, with a hostile population at your back, it is impossible to keep an army in the field without an equally large army to guard your communications, suppress sabotage, etc. Obviously, therefore, there was no real popular movement in Franco's rear. It was inconceivable that the people in his territory, at any rate the town workers and the poorer peasants, liked or wanted Franco. But with every swing to the right, the government's superiority became less apparent. What clinches everything is the case of Morocco. Why was there no rising in Morocco? Franco was trying to set up an infamous dictatorship, and the Moors actually preferred him to the Popular Front government. The palpable truth is that no attempt was made to foment a rising in Morocco, because to do so would have meant putting a revolutionary construction on the war. The first necessity, to convince the Moors of the government's good faith, would have been to proclaim Morocco liberated, and we can imagine how pleased the French would have been by that. The best strategic opportunity of the war was flung away in the vain hope of placating French and British capitalism. The whole tendency of the communist policy was to reduce the war to an ordinary non-revolutionary war in which the government was heavily handicapped. For a war of that kind has got to be won by mechanical means, i.e. ultimately by limitless supplies of weapons, and the government's chief donor of weapons, the USSR, was at a great disadvantage geographically compared with Italy and Germany. Perhaps the POUM and anarchist slogan, "The war and the revolution are inseparable," was less visionary than it sounds. I have given my reasons for thinking that the communist anti-revolutionary policy was mistaken, but so far as its effect upon the war goes, I do not hope that my judgment is right. 1,000 times I hope that it is wrong. I would wish to see this war won by any means whatever, and of course we cannot tell yet what may happen. The government may swing to the left again, the Moors may revolt of their own accord, England may decide to buy Italy out. The war may be won by straightforward military means. There is no knowing. I let the above opinions stand, and time will show how far I am right or wrong. But in February 1937, I did not see things quite in this light. I was sick of the inaction on the Aragon front, and chiefly conscious that I had not done my fair share of the fighting. I used to think of the recruiting poster in Barcelona which demanded accusingly of passers-by, "What have you done for democracy?" and feel that I could only answer, "I have drawn my rations." When I joined the militia, I had promised myself to kill one fascist. After all, if each of us killed one, they would soon be extinct. And I had killed nobody yet, had hardly had the chance to do so. And of course I wanted to go to Madrid. Everyone in the army, whatever his political opinions, always wanted to go to Madrid. This would probably mean exchanging into the international column. For the POUM had very few troops at Madrid, and the anarchists not so many as formerly. For the present, of course, one had to stay in the line, but I told everyone that when we went on leave I should, if possible, exchange into the international column, which meant putting myself under communist control. Various people tried to dissuade me, but no one attempted to interfere. It is fair to say that there was very little heresy hunting in the POUM, perhaps not enough considering their special circumstances. Short of being a pro-fascist, no one was penalised for holding the wrong political opinions. I spent much of my time in the militia in bitterly criticising the POUM line, but I never got into trouble for it. There was not even any pressure upon one to become a political member of the party, though I think the majority of the militiamen did so. I myself never joined the party, for which afterwards, when the POUM was suppressed, I was rather sorry. End of chapter 5.